Have you ever been left by someone who acted like it meant nothing? Like you were just a small chapter they could close without even looking back? It's confusing, isn't it? One moment you are sharing something real, something deep, something that feels rare. And the next, they pull away. Cold, distant, almost like none of it ever mattered. No explanation that satisfies you, no emotion that matches what you felt. Just silence, or worse, indifference. And the hardest part? They don't look broken. They don't look like they're hurting. They don't look like they regret anything. So your mind starts asking questions you can't escape. Was it ever real? Did I mean anything to them? Why do they seem so okay while I'm still trying to breathe through this? But what if I told you, what you're seeing is not the full truth? What if the calm face, the distance, the silence is not strength, but protection? Because avoidant people have a pattern most people don't understand until it's too late. They don't break down in front of you. They don't chase you when things fall apart. They don't fight for connection the way others do. Instead, they withdraw. They shut down. They disappear emotionally. Sometimes even physically. And from the outside, it looks like they've already moved on. But here's the truth most people never hear. Avoidants don't feel less. They feel differently. And more importantly, they process emotions in a completely different order. While you are feeling everything right now, they are feeling almost nothing. Not because the connection didn't matter, but because their mind is wired to protect them from intensity. Closeness triggers them. Vulnerability overwhelms them. Emotional depth feels like losing control. So when things get real, not fake, not surface level, but real, they don't lean in. They pull away. And when they pull away, they feel relief. Yes, relief, not heartbreak, not regret, not longing, relief. Because to them, distance feels safe. Distance feels like breathing again. Distance feels like they escaped something that was starting to consume them. And that's the part that hurts you the most. Because while you are sitting there, trying to understand what went wrong, they look like they just freed themselves from something heavy. It makes you question your worth. It makes you question your reality. It makes you question if you imagine the whole connection. But listen carefully. Just because someone looks okay does not mean they are at peace. There is a difference, a deep difference. And if you understand this one thing, everything will start to make sense. Avoidants are not emotionless. They are emotionally delayed. What you feel now, they feel later. What breaks you today breaks them when it's already too late. But in the beginning, they don't show regret. They don't even feel it. They feel powerful, in control, untouched. And that illusion, that temporary emotional silence, is what fools everyone. It fools you into thinking you meant nothing. It fools them into thinking they made the right choice. But time always reveals what avoidance tries to hide, because emotions don't disappear. They wait. They sit quietly beneath the surface, building, growing, until something triggers them. And when that moment comes, it doesn't come softly. It doesn't come gradually. It hits all at once, like a wave they didn't expect, like a truth they can't escape. And that is the moment. Everything changes for them. That is the moment. The silence inside them breaks. That is the moment. The reality they avoided finally catches up. And here's why you need to stay with me until the end. Because once you understand what that one trigger is, you will stop chasing answers. You will stop blaming yourself. You will stop trying to prove your worth to someone who could not hold it. More than that, you will gain something most people never get after heartbreak: clarity, power, and control over your emotions. You will finally understand why they acted the way they did, why they seemed unaffected, and what truly happens inside them when regret finally shows up. Because the truth is, there is one specific moment, one shift, one realization that hits an avoidant harder than anything else. And when it happens, all the emotions they avoided, all the feelings they ran from, all the truth they suppressed comes rushing back. But by then, everything is different. And that is where the real story begins. That is why the first mistake people make is believing an avoidant leaves because they never felt anything meaningful. But that is almost never the real reason. They leave because what they feel starts becoming too strong, too close, too exposing. And for someone with an avoidant pattern, emotional intensity does not feel romantic. It feels dangerous. What looks like detachment on the outside is often a survival response on the inside. They are not always escaping you. Many times they are escaping what being close to you awakens in them. To understand this, you have to stop looking only at their behavior and start looking at the fear underneath it. Human beings are not driven only by desire. They are also driven by protection. And for avoidant people, protection often becomes stronger than connection. Somewhere deep in their psychology, closeness has been linked to discomfort. Need has been linked to weakness. Dependence has been linked to pain. So when a bond begins to feel serious, their nervous system does not always read it as safety. It reads it as risk. That is why they can want love and still run from it. They can enjoy your presence and still create distance. They can care deeply and still behave in ways that make no sense to someone who loves in a more open way. This is what confuses so many people. Because you are looking at the contradiction and asking, if they cared, why would they pull away? But that question comes from a healthy emotional logic. Avoidant behavior does not always follow healthy emotional logic. It follows fear, and fear does not need a clear reason to take control. It only needs a trigger. Sometimes the trigger is emotional closeness becoming too real. Sometimes it is being seen too deeply. Sometimes it is the pressure of commitment. Sometimes it is your consistency, your warmth, your honesty. Yes, even healthy love can become a trigger for someone who has been conditioned to mistrust intimacy. Because when a person is used to distance, real closeness can feel overwhelming. Not because it is wrong, but because it asks them to lower the walls they built to survive. That is where the real problem begins. At first, an avoidant may move toward you with curiosity. They may seem interested, engaged, even emotionally present in flashes. They may open up just enough to make you believe something solid is forming. And often it is. The connection is not always fake. The emotions are not always shallow. But once the relationship starts moving from excitement into emotional responsibility, their internal alarm starts waking up. And this is the part most people do not understand. Avoidants are usually comfortable with connection only when it stays at a level they can control. As long as they can manage the distance, keep one foot out the door, and avoid full emotional exposure, they feel relatively safe. But the moment love begins asking for consistency, honesty, accountability, patience, reassurance, or deeper emotional presence, they begin to feel trapped by what should have made them feel secure. That is why they often confuse love with pressure. Not because love itself is pressure, but because they experience emotional closeness as a loss of freedom. They start feeling like someone is getting too close to the parts of them they work hardest to hide, their imperfections, their fear, their need, their vulnerability, and instead of saying, "I'm scared," they often say nothing at all. They withdraw. They become harder to reach. They delay conversations. They reduce affection. They create emotional static until the connection becomes painful for both people. And if you have ever been on the receiving end of this, you know how brutal it feels. Because when someone is slowly fading while standing right in front of you, it can make you feel powerless. It can make you start shrinking yourself just to keep them comfortable. You talk less, ask for less, need less. You become more careful with your words, more patient with their silence, more forgiving of behavior that slowly breaks your spirit. And without realizing it, you begin carrying the emotional weight of two people while they keep moving further away from the very closeness they once welcomed. But here is what you must understand if you want to stop blaming yourself. Their withdrawal is not proof that you were too much. It is often proof that the connection reached a depth they were not equipped to handle. That is an important difference. Too many people walk away from avoidant relationships believing they loved too deeply, felt too strongly, expected too much, or ruined something good by asking for honesty. But wanting clarity is not too much. Wanting consistency is not too much. Wanting emotional presence is not too much. Those are not unreasonable needs. Those are signs of a real relationship. The problem is not that you asked for something impossible. The problem is that they were emotionally unequipped to meet what real closeness requires. And because they are emotionally unequipped, they often choose the one thing that gives them immediate comfort: escape, not healing, not communication, not emotional growth. Escape. That escape can take many forms. It can look like needing space. It can look like becoming busy. It can look like acting numb. It can look like becoming cold for no clear reason. It can look like making you feel like the relationship suddenly became too heavy, even though nothing changed except the depth of what was being built. And that is why being involved with an avoidant can feel so destabilizing. One day you feel chosen, the next day you feel invisible. But there is a deeper truth hidden inside all of this. When avoidants run, they are often not running from pain itself. They are running from the possibility of being emotionally dependent on something they cannot control. That is what terrifies them, because real love humbles the ego. It asks a person to care beyond comfort. It asks them to stay when it would be easier to shut down. It asks them to let another human matter. And to someone who has built their identity around self-protection, that kind of emotional surrender can feel unbearable. So they leave before they feel too much. They disconnect before they need too much. They disappear before they are forced to face too much. And in that moment, it can seem like they won. It can seem like they escaped cleanly while you are left holding all the emotional damage. But what feels like freedom in the beginning is often only borrowed time, because what they avoid now does not stay buried forever. And that is exactly where the next layer of this truth begins. When pulling away gives them the illusion that they are finally free. And that illusion of freedom is exactly what makes this stage so deceptive. Because after an avoidant creates distance, something very specific happens inside them. It is not deep wisdom. It is not emotional maturity. It is not true inner balance. It is a short-term sense of release, a sudden drop in emotional pressure, a temporary return to internal control. And to them, that feeling can seem like proof they did the right thing. This is why so many people get hurt trying to understand an avoidant too early. They are looking for signs of sadness in someone who is still in the relief stage. They are hoping for visible pain from a person whose nervous system is still rewarding escape. And if you do not understand this phase, you will read their silence as certainty. You will read their calmness as closure. You will read their distance as a final answer. But what you are often seeing is not the end of their emotional process. It is only the first layer of it. Human psychology works in patterns. When a person feels overwhelmed for long enough, the moment that pressure disappears, the body reacts. It relaxes. It settles. It tells the mind, "Good, we survived that." Avoidants experience this strongly when they step away from emotional intensity. They may feel lighter, less burdened, more mentally clear, more self-contained. And because that shift feels so immediate, they mistake relief for truth. That is where the trap begins, because immediate relief can feel convincing. It can make a person believe they escaped the real problem, when in reality, they only escaped the discomfort of facing themselves. This is what avoidants often confuse. They do not always understand that the thing making them uncomfortable was not always the relationship itself. Sometimes it was the emotional exposure the relationship required. Sometimes it was the mirror it held up. Sometimes it was the closeness that forced them to feel what they usually spend their lives suppressing. But when they walk away, they no longer have to sit with any of that. No one is asking them hard questions. No one is asking for emotional honesty. No one is asking them to show up consistently. No one is standing close enough to activate their deeper fears, and in that temporary space, they feel better. That better can be dangerous, because the human mind loves anything that removes discomfort quickly. It becomes very easy for a person to believe something is healthy simply because it feels easier. But easier is not always healthier. Numbness can feel easier than vulnerability. Avoidance can feel easier than communication. Distance can feel easier than intimacy, and yet none of those things lead to real peace. They only delay what still needs to be faced. This is why avoidants often look the strongest right after they pull away. They may appear more social, more relaxed, more focused, even more confident. They may laugh, post, stay active, Keep moving. They may seem untouched by what just happened, and if you are still emotionally attached, this can feel like a knife twisting inside your chest. Because while you are trying to survive the emotional impact, they look like they are enjoying life without you. That visual contrast can destroy your self-worth if you are not careful. It can make you think they were never affected. It can make you think your value disappeared the moment they left. It can make you think they are thriving because losing you meant nothing. But that interpretation is often incomplete. What you are seeing is someone who has escaped the emotional heat of closeness, not someone who has truly processed the loss. Those are two very different things. Escaping pressure creates a high. Processing loss creates depth. And avoidants are often far more familiar with the first than the second. That is why the early phase after distance can feel so misleading. Inside themselves, they may genuinely believe they are fine. They may tell themselves they needed this. They may create a story that justifies the separation. Maybe it was too intense. Maybe it was too complicated. Maybe they just weren't ready. Maybe the connection felt like too much responsibility. And because the discomfort is gone, these stories feel believable. But there is a major psychological reason these stories do not hold forever. When the body is in protection mode, it does not tell the full truth. It tells the version of truth that keeps a person emotionally functional in the moment. It prioritizes safety over depth. It prioritizes short-term stability over long-term honesty. So the avoidant mind often rewrites the emotional meaning of a relationship in order to reduce inner tension. It minimizes the bond. It downplays the loss. It creates emotional distance in thought before the heart has had time to catch up. This is not always done consciously. Often it happens automatically. That is why someone can look detached while still being deeply affected at levels they have not yet reached. Their emotional system has not fully opened the file yet. It has only closed the immediate emergency. And that is why so many avoidants delay their pain. Not because they are stronger, not because they are colder, but because their mind postpones what their heart cannot yet handle. This is one of the cruelest truths in these dynamics. The person who seems least affected at the beginning is often the one whose emotions arrive later, when there is no longer any easy way to repair what was lost. And the person who suffers first is often the one who ends up healing sooner, simply because they faced reality earlier. That is why you must not measure emotional truth by timing. Someone who cries now is not weaker than someone who smiles now. Someone who feels deeply today is not less powerful than someone who appears unaffected today. In many cases, the opposite is true. The person willing to feel is already moving through the pain. The person avoiding it is only postponing the cost, and that postponed cost does not disappear. It waits. It waits in the quiet moments. It waits after the distraction fades. It waits after the ego stops performing strength. It waits until life becomes still enough for what was buried to rise. That is the part most avoidants do not see coming. Because in the beginning, distance feels like a solution. It feels like release. It feels like reclaiming control. But over time, something subtle starts changing. The emotional noise settles. The nervous system stops reacting. The immediate pressure is gone. And when that happens, the mind no longer has the same excuse to stay disconnected from what was real. That is when the deeper truth begins moving closer. Not all at once, not dramatically at first, but quietly, a thought, a memory, a moment of emptiness where relief used to be. And this is where everything starts to shift, because what they first experienced as freedom slowly begins revealing itself as something very different. And that is the moment where most people get the entire situation wrong, because what begins to surface inside an avoidant after the relief fades is not peace. It only looked like peace from a distance. What was actually there was emotional quietness created by escape. And emotional quietness is not the same thing as inner resolution. One is a pause, the other is healing. One is the absence of pressure, the other is the presence of truth. And those two things should never be confused. This is where human psychology becomes powerful to understand, because the mind can create a false sense of stability when discomfort disappears. If a person has spent days, weeks, or months feeling emotionally stretched, then the moment they remove the source of that stretch, they feel lighter. But lighter does not always mean better. Sometimes it only means they stepped away from the thing, exposing what still needs work inside them. And this is exactly what happens to many avoidants. They think they found calm, when all they really found was temporary emotional silence. That silence can be seductive. It can make a person believe they have finally found balance. It can make them think distance solved everything. It can make them assume the relationship was the issue, not the emotional patterns they brought into it. But unresolved emotions do not disappear just because they become quiet for a while. They simply stop making noise until the environment becomes still enough for them to be heard again. This is why an avoidant can look composed on the outside while something deeper is slowly shifting underneath. At first, they may still feel convinced they made the right decision. They may still tell themselves that stepping away was necessary. They may continue with life, routines, conversations, distractions, responsibilities. They may appear steady, functional, even comfortable. But the human mind can only suppress truth for so long before small cracks begin to appear. And those cracks usually do not start with dramatic heartbreak. They start with emptiness, a strange emotional flatness, a missing energy they cannot quite name, a subtle sense that something meaningful is no longer there. This is important because people often imagine regret as something loud. They imagine it as crying, breaking down, reaching out immediately, or suddenly admitting everything. But for avoidance, emotional recognition often starts much more quietly. It begins as an absence, a shift in atmosphere, a realization that life feels less alive than expected. The space they fought for starts feeling less satisfying than they imagined it would. And that is where the illusion begins falling apart, because relief only works while the nervous system still believes it escaped danger. But once the internal alarm settles down, the emotional truth starts becoming harder to outrun. That is when the person is no longer reacting to pressure. They are left alone with what remains after the pressure is gone. And if the relationship mattered, if the bond carried depth, if the connection touched something real inside them, then eventually the emptiness begins speaking. At first, they may try to ignore it. They may distract themselves. Stay busy, keep moving, keep their attention scattered. But unresolved attachment has a way of returning in quiet moments. It returns when stimulation drops. It returns at night. It returns during stillness. It returns in the spaces where performance ends and a person has no choice but to sit with themselves. That is when the emotional meaning of what happened begins rising from underneath the protective layers they built around it. And this is the difference so many people miss. Relief removes tension, but peace removes conflict. Relief says, I got away from what was overwhelming me. Peace says, I can face what is real without running from it. Avoidants often reach the first one quickly. The second one takes much longer because it demands emotional honesty. It demands self-confrontation. It demands looking inward without hiding behind distance. That is hard for anyone. But for someone trained to disconnect from emotional discomfort, it can feel almost unbearable. Because true peace requires a person to ask difficult questions. Why did I leave instead of communicating? Why did closeness make me feel trapped? Why did I feel safer pulling away than being honest? Why did I push away something that was trying to love me? Those questions are not easy. They shake identity. They expose wounds. They challenge the story a person has been telling themselves for years. And this is exactly why relief feels more attractive than healing. Relief asks for nothing except escape. Healing asks for courage. That is why avoidants often remain in emotional limbo longer than they realize. Outwardly, they may continue living as if everything is settled. But inwardly, a quiet discomfort begins growing, not dramatic enough to force immediate action, not obvious enough to explain clearly, but present enough to disturb their internal sense of certainty. They start noticing the emotional stillness does not feel fulfilling. The freedom they chased begins carrying an unexpected emptiness. And this is where the psychology turns. Because once a person no longer feels overwhelmed, the thing they ran from can finally be evaluated more clearly. The nervous system is no longer screaming for distance. The emotional fog begins lifting. And when that happens, memory starts becoming more honest. They begin remembering how safe they felt in certain moments, how seen they felt in certain conversations, how rare your presence actually was, how much warmth existed in the bond they convinced themselves was too heavy. This does not always happen in one dramatic wave. Often, it comes in fragments. a song, a thought, a routine that feels different now. A moment where they instinctively want to share something and suddenly realize they no longer have access to the person who once held that space. And these moments matter because they slowly expose the emotional cost of what they chose. This is why silence can become uncomfortable for an avoidant later, even if they once craved it, because silence only feels safe when it still protects them from what they fear. Once the fear calms down, silence starts reflecting what is missing. It becomes a mirror, and mirrors are dangerous for people who have spent years avoiding what lives underneath their own defenses. So, no, relief is not peace. Peace does not require emotional disappearance. Peace does not come from cutting off what was meaningful. Peace does not leave a strange emptiness behind. Peace can hold truth. Peace can hold vulnerability. Peace can sit with love without feeling threatened by it. And if someone has not learned how to do that, then what they call peace is often only emotional avoidance wearing a calm face. That is why this stage matters so much, because this is where the false comfort begins losing its power. This is where the first internal shift begins. This is where the avoidant starts moving from numb certainty into quiet emotional exposure. They may not fully understand it yet. They may not even admit it yet. But something inside them has started changing. And that change becomes even more intense when one specific realization finally hits them. The realization that the person they expected to remain emotionally available is no longer there in the same way.